This podcast is brought to you by the National Fallen Firefighters Foundation. Their mission is to honor America's fallen fire heroes, support their families, colleagues, and organizations, and work to reduce preventable firefighter death and injury. Learn more at firehero.org.
Hey, and welcome back to Fire Apparatus and Emergency Equipment podcast. I'm Nick Wilbur, joined again with Win Slauch. Today, we're talking about a question that was emailed in to Chris McClune. It's basically talking about aluminum versus stainless steel bodies, undercoating, painting, protecting. Pretty much we're going from the operational side to more maybe the maintenance and underside of the vehicle. And how are we going to take care of this vehicle, and how are we going to make this vehicle last that 10, 15, 20 years that we're going to need this vehicle to last. And we're taking this question on wholesale. We're just going to take the information, just have a nice conversation about it, and probably throw a bunch of tidbits out there and hopefully cover a lot of information. So we'll talk about, stainless steel versus aluminum. It's a big topic out there. Different things are offered from different manufacturers. And I'll throw it right to Win, and we'll just jump right in.
Yeah. So, again, like Nick said, there's a multitude of products that fire truck manufacturers are building apparatus out of. Some of them will build the product out of one type of material. Some of them will mix materials. But again, there's that variety. And we talked about, Nick mentioned that aluminum and stainless, but there's also a galvanneal option out there that's available as well. That's a lower cost product. But again, with that, you really want to be very careful on where you're putting that product in the United States, essentially. So, to kind of talk about the galvanneal, the aluminum, and the stainless, I think, a great analogy is if you're going to build a deck for your house, you have a kind of a multitude of materials to choose from there, whether it's pressure treated, lumber, to a more rot resistant type of wood, be it mahogany or cedar, and then all the way up into the engineered type of plastic woods that we're dealing with now. And again, there's a multitude of different manufacturers of that. But what you would see, and if you want to equate that to the fire service, is the galvanneal is going to be that pressure treated. Again, you have to be careful with where you put that. But if I'm going to flip a home, then I'm probably going to put a pressure treated deck on it, because I want it to have that aesthetic, that look, that feel, but I don't want to spend a whole bunch of money doing it. So again, if I'm going to build a fire truck in Arizona or the West Coast, where, and even on the coast, you want to be careful, but somewhere where the humidity is low, where they're not treating roads with the harsh chemicals that we see here, in the Northeast and, throughout the mid-Atlantic, then the galvanneal might be a good option for me, especially if I'm looking at saving money in today's world of super expensive fire trucks. The next step up from there in the fire truck world would be aluminum. In the lumber world, you get a little questionable, because aluminum and stainless have very similar properties. However, the aluminum is going to have a little less corrosion resistance than the stainless. And then even when we bump up into stainless, we're talking about two different types of stainless. We're talking about a 304 stainless, which is going to have more corrosive properties or corrosion resistance properties. And we're also going to talk about 3CR12, or what they call chromium. A little bit less weight, a little bit less money than the 304, but again, you're going to have a little bit less corrosion properties with that. So those are really the four types of materials that we're looking at building fire trucks, at least on the top side of your frame rails.
Yeah, I think a lot of that, you kind of mentioned the corrosion resistance, like that's a huge kind of talking point. And I think, dealing with, talking with Syracuse, New York, all those companies outside that area in New York, up in the Northeast, the Midwest, there's a lot of snow and de-icing chemicals that they're dealing with, and it's just getting harsher and harsher. And again, the more crowded the roads are, the more pressure there is to clear the roads and put more chemicals down. So there's a lot to deal with there. And so there's a lot of places taking a lot of unique steps to try, with that corrosion resistance. You bring up an interesting thing about cost, and then, we always talk about this in every single podcast. It comes back to the weight. That's like probably what centers everything else out there is the weight. And something that I think, needs to be brought into this conversation too is the protection. No matter what material you pick to go underneath, there's got to be some sort of inspection and preventive maintenance program in place. There's no, not that we've seen out there, there's like, we're just going to put this thing in there and for the next 30 years, it's going to be good. Maybe if you're in sunny, Alabama somewhere where there's no moisture from the sea and, no road salt or any chemicals on the road, like maybe that could be a possibility. But for most of the East Coast, for anything along the seaboard or anything in a snow belt, there's going to have to be some sort of inspection and maintenance. And I feel like that's probably one of the biggest things. Everyone sits down in that pre-engineering room and talks about all this stuff they're going to do to make sure that the bottom of the fire truck doesn't rust out. But then at year 5, 10, 15, no one's actually looked underneath to see what's kind of going on underneath there until there is an issue, until something falls out.
Right. So you throw a lot out there. So where do you want to start? Let's talk about like just the area of the country where you live in. Obviously, from, a lot of people don't think about it. They think about the East Coast, the upper East Coast, or, the Northeast and Mid-Atlantic being the area where we have to be careful with, salt and, even in and around the Great Lakes into the Midwest, obviously the upper Midwest where they're using the chemicals on the road. But a lot of people don't think about just the humidity from how close you live to the ocean. And essentially from Maine all the way, the coastline from Maine all the way down into Texas and obviously then into Mexico, is the humidity level there you're in a very, very high corrosive environment. A good way, halfway through the states that you're living in along those coastlines. And then also when you get up around the Great Lakes, the Great Lakes even push a little bit farther south. So a good portion off the Great Lakes into Kentucky, into the middle of Pennsylvania, obviously all of New York, but that whole coastline around all of the Great Lakes is also an area of high humidity and high corrosive environments. And then the strip of land or strip of, property or land that runs straight down through the middle of all that, it backs it off a little bit, but we're still dealing with the corrosiveness. Maybe not humidity wise as much, but corrosiveness, we're still dealing with that. So, again, that's the East Coast. The West Coast is very similar. You get into, obviously, along the coastline, we're going to have issues. Now, as we push into like the lower Arizona, things like that, so where it's a dry, hot temperature, you're not going to have that humidity. They're not dealing with the corrosive environments. But you have to think about that when you're starting, your apparatus. And, again, we talk about this material on top of the trucks, same thing on top of a deck. We can do everything we want on top of the fire trucks to deal with it. But if we don't take care of the undercarriage, basically from the wheels up, then we're going to start to have issues there. And that's where we're going to see it. And then every manufacturer has their own way of dealing with, their own basic way, let's put it that way, of dealing with that undercarriage, whether it's galvanizing the frame rails, whether it's an e-coat type process or, whatever. They have their own starting point with where they want to deal with that. And they, again, every one of them thinks that theirs is the best. But you really want to do you want to do the investigation to figure out which truly is the best and which do you want to do. Not all of them offer, the same type of frame rail. Some of them offer, all different kinds. And then there's all different types of coatings that you can put on it that will just continue to build upon that protection. So I'll let you throw out like where you want to go from there.
I think, one of the biggest learning points for me recently was, a fleet evaluation we were doing. And we evaluate a lot of fleets across the country. And one thing that we've kind of seen is the painted frame rails, right? And And what we mean by that is you go and you say, hey, listen, when we're speccing a fire truck out, it was a $4,000 option. Now, I mean, throw a number out there. It's probably still less than 10,000, but definitely probably more than four, to prime and paint the frame rails like you would job color the side of the fire truck. And what that does is it kind of shows, if there is any rusting, what's going on, right? It's a different color than a lot of the other components. You can see where it's wearing away and touch it up. And it also provides that protection like the side of the fire truck would. If your side of your fire truck's not rusting out, there's a good chance the underside is probably not rusting out either. But again, that comes with good care and maintenance with that to inspect to make sure the paint's good. But on top of that, so we've seen that has been a good protector. And now on top of that, there's, companies and manufacturers that are putting other products on top. They're putting more protection on top of that. We've seen Crown or Carwell, which is a yearly application on top of those, to kind of help protect the underside. It doesn't have to be painted frame rails, but whatever, that's the extra protection. But then there's other protections that some manufacturers are putting on there that actually almost hurt them because you can't do a good inspection. You can't really see what's going on. And actually, there's some underside protections you can put on yearly that do the same thing. And so I think maybe kind of talking about the importance of weighing the options that there is too much. You can do too much underneath there where at a certain point, you're just making it pretty much so that you can't see or understand or know what's going on. And there's a lot of stuff that's kind of hidden out there, and your corrosion can start kind of within.
Right. Yeah. So you touched on a lot of stuff there. I'm a huge fan of painted frame rails. Galvanized frame rails is a big thing. That's a lot of manufacturers have done them for a lot of times. Galvanized frame rails, galvanized outriggers. Everything on the underside of the truck is galvanized, and that's a really, really great form of protection. The issues that you might hear from some people is if the galvanized gets scratched off. And again, if you're looking at what galvanized is, it's essentially guardrails on the side of the street. They're a galvanized steel. But if they get scratched, if something hits it, then the potential for corrosion starts to begin. Now, part of the galvanizing process helps that. It's treated with zinc. So even a small scratch, the rust is not going to start immediately. It's going to eat away at the coating that's around that first prior to a rusting. So if you have a good inspection process there, and you see that, then you can get under there, and then you could take care of that with a cold galvanized spray and build that protection back up. Again, I'm a huge fan of painted frame rails, whether they're galvanized or not. I think that a painted frame rail and painted job color is the key, makes the inspection process a whole lot easier. It's cleaner than just a black frame rail, which is the standard. But you paint it job color, red, blue, whatever, as long as it's not black. I mean, if you're going to have a black fire truck, then you might want to paint your frame rails a contrasting color. But again, it allows you to get under there and you can see the damage and you can take care of the damage early on. The additional protections that you're talking about, sure, there are spray-on coatings that we've seen that go over top of the paint that provide that. To me, and like you said, you saw in your one of your last inspections, is that when that damage occurs, because it's harder to see, you miss that, and then you can allow the rust or the corrosion to start to form underneath of that what's supposed to be a corrosive protective layer. So again, I think paint's the best way to go. I think it's nice and clean, and then upon that, you build upon that yearly steam clean, pressure wash. And then a yearly treatment with a product like you talked about with Carwell or Crown, or a spray on rust inhibitor that still allows you to have that nice clean look. But, over the wintertime, it's providing the extra protection to your area. And then plus you're doing that yearly steam clean, which helps you be able to inspect the underside of your chassis and check for damage. And then if there's anything there, we can get it taken care of relatively quickly before we start to have those corrosive properties built into that.
And so I think one thing, we talk about money being a huge factor today, with just everything costing a lot of money. And, we found this information of that undercoating at Work Truck Week, and this is it isn't even a fire truck conference that we went to. It's just generally any work truck or utility type vehicle for industry. And you talk to the snowplow operators, like how are they keeping snowplows for 20, 30 years? And that's exactly what they're doing. In the springtime, when the snow goes away, they're taking it, they're steam cleaning, they're doing inspections, they're keeping up on it, and they're putting this preventive coating on. And every year they're doing this. And, if it's really bad, they'll do it twice a year, right? Just to make sure everything's kind of good to go. And I think that's something that the fire department across the board of just preventative maintenance. I mean, we've gone to some places and, you ask for maintenance records, and 1 year they're spending $382, and then 3 years later they're spending almost $40,000 taking care of a fire truck. We found that as we do these inspections, depending on the type of vehicle, who you buy it from, the options that you put on it, a fire truck's going to cost a couple $1,000s a year. It could be $6,000 to $10,000. In an aerial or more specialized vehicle with more, it could probably be a little bit more, but that's about the ballpark of what it's going to take to keep a vehicle on the road with proper inspections, maintenance, testing that's required by NFPA and just industry standard. And I think that's one thing that, whatever you spec, and again, this could go to a fire truck today. You could have not painted frame rails. You could have not done whatever. You can still have a good fire truck and keep it and make it last by just doing those proper inspections. And again, just the simple pressure wash to clean the dirt and grime off at the end of the year will definitely go a long way. I think that that kind of talks about a lot of that stuff, and then you can even get into the materials for the aerials too. Between steel and aluminum for that. One of the calls that kind of sticks out to me, I was on Prince George's County in College Park. We were on the fire where there was the lava from a roof builder company that was caught on fire, and some of the roofing material caught fire and spread down and caught 2 fire trucks on fire in Prince George's County. And we came in on the second alarm, and we actually had to put the fire trucks out, which was probably one of the weirdest assignments I've ever gotten. Is, hey, go put that fire truck out. It's like, oh, okay, that's crazy. One was made out of aluminum, one was made out of stainless steel, and one didn't really exist anymore, and one did. At the end of the day, right, in today's day and age, although there's the shell still there, I don't know that really mattered that much, right? Like, you're not really saving that much from that. So, maybe let's talk about the top side. And then we also talked about too, the mixing of materials. Just because one part is aluminum or stainless steel doesn't mean the rest is. So I guess we can kind of talk about how to maybe identify those different parts and figure out what parts are important to be aluminum or stainless steel or anything like that.
Yeah, I think at the end of the day, like you talked about money there, right? And it's the same analogy when you go back to the decks, right? If I'm going to flip a house, if I only plan on keeping it for a short time, then I don't need to spend the money on a whole lot of corrosive protection, right? I want to make sure it lasts as long as I'm going to keep it. But I also don't need, if I'm going to replace my fire trucks because of my fleet replacement plan every 8 to 10 years, then stainless steel might not be the option that I need. If I need to keep this fire truck for 15 plus years, and especially, today with the fire trucks being built a little bit differently, 15 to 20 years is probably the top end of where you're going to expect this fire truck with all the electronics and everything to be, functional, but we might be trying to keep it longer than that. Then I want to spend as much money as I can up front to build that protection into it for the long term of that fire truck. Again, when you look at it, it's pennies on the dollar, at the front versus what you're going to pay over the 20 years of that fire truck. So, again, it comes down to that functionality, having those conversations about what you're going to do with this fire truck, how long you're going to keep it, and what benefits you're going to get out of all these options that are available. At the end of the day, if your fire truck's going to burn up, it probably doesn't matter what type of material you use. If you're gonna base building a fire truck stainless steel, aluminum, galvanneal, or build it out of wood or whatever, it doesn't really matter once it gets lit on fire at a couple thousand degrees. You probably, other than getting a little bit more money in the scrapyard for it, because there's something to scrap versus molten lava, then, it is what it is at that point. But again, it's pennies on the dollar that you're getting back. So I guess it just depends on how to look at that. But you're right. Some manufacturers will only build an aluminum cab, and some manufacturers will only build a stainless cab or some other types of materials, and then they'll mix them, so you get an aluminum cab and a stainless body. But again, that's based on manufacturing processes and how fast they can build a cab. A stainless cab is going to take longer to build than an aluminum cab. There's extrusions, there's things like that allow the process to be sped up. So they're going to want to take advantage of that, at all costs. The other thing to think about, so when you're speccing your trucks, you have to, again, do that research. What do you want? Are you okay with, I want a fire truck that's going to last me 15 or 20 years. But the manufacturer that I want doesn't offer a stainless cab. Well, are you okay with that? Are you okay with the aluminum cab and a stainless body? Or do you need to look at a manufacturer that's going to offer you stainless steel all the way around? And again, it comes down to what you want out of that fire truck. Along with that, and again, this is something we hit on every time. You hit on a little bit earlier, is the weight. Stainless steel is obviously a heavier material, and that can limit some cab manufacturers with options that they have available, even all the way down to what size motor they can put in this cab. And I think we're going to see that here in the next year or so, as these cab manufacturers are forced to start to re-engineer their cabs to fit these two types of engines that are going to be available in 2026 in the fire market. So I think we're going to see that. We're going to see some changes in the way they do things, because if you only have a small block and a big block engine, and the weight difference is going to be pretty drastic in those, then the weight on those front axles is going to change, and some things along the way are going to have to change in certain cab manufacturers. So again, that's that weight's going to be a big thing. And then even past that, you talk about aluminum versus stainless and using multiple different types of materials in the process. You're also going to have manufacturers who are using multiple different types of stainless in that process, because of how the stainless works. A 3CR12 or a chromium type stainless is a cheaper material to build with. But depending on the type of finish that you're looking for, if you're looking for a DA finish or things like that, or even in areas where wheel wells, where corrosiveness is going to be enhanced, they're going to switch that to a 304 stainless. So you'll even have multiple types of stainless being used in your fire truck because of where it's going to be used or how it's going to be finished. So again, you want to pay attention to that. You want to question the manufacturers in the process of what type of stainless they're using. And same thing when you're looking at comparing the price of a fire truck, if you're bidding it or going through a consortium and looking at two different prices, the type of stainless, the type of material is going to dictate the price of that fire truck. So if you say, hey, I want a stainless steel body, and you have two prices that are way off, you need to kind of question what type of stainless each manufacturer is using and weigh that out on whether that benefit of the cost savings versus the corrosion protection is worth it in that sense.
And one big thing going back to that is weight, right? If you look at one fire truck weight analysis, and that should be something standard, right, that we're getting on every single fire truck we buy, the weight analysis to figure out where our weights are at. And if you're looking at one and there's more weight on one than the other, that could be a big determining factor. And, as you start increasing that weight, you start increasing axles, wheels, tires, rims, right? Suspension. So like that starts kind of tacking up those dollar figures. So, it's definitely something to watch out for. And to go back to the other way, I remember, College Park getting into our new ladder truck, we lost like 4,000 pounds of weight from just different engineering and different choices that we had made between, again, just different tensile strengths of steel for the ladder up top, and, different cab configurations and frame rail configurations. But we really didn't account for that. We kind of dropped the ball, to be honest, on how much weight we're actually losing. So we didn't really downgrade some of the axles or downgrade some of the suspensions, and so our ride is a bit rougher than it could have been if we kind of paid attention to that. So, I mean, all these materials and what you're going to do affect everything above it. And there's, definitely component pieces in there too to watch out for. Although you build a stainless steel cab and chassis, there's a possibility that they're using steel fuel tanks or steel straps to hold the fuel tank on, or air tank straps for steel. And all these things are prime things that, because they're right underneath in those conditions, that could rust away and fall away. And the last thing you want to do is lose fuel tanks. And so a lot of manufacturers, that's pretty standard now to go stainless steel on all those straps. But again, something else you want to pay attention to as, the industry gets to where it is, where you have a $2 million fire truck sitting on a lot waiting for, a couple $1,000 generator, or, one ground ladder at $2,000 is holding up a $2 million sale. There's going to be some pressure here to get these fire trucks out the door. So if some of these materials or components aren't available, that's something that I would 100% want to know and understand in final inspection. I've seen final inspections last anywhere from, 2 hours, I think 2.5 hours was the shortest. We got to lunchtime, and then they just never came back. And then all the way out to, 3 or 4 days, depending on the type of rig that you're doing. And it goes back to just looking at the specification, asking the right questions, asking for the right material, and then following it through all the way to the end, and not just trusting them. You got to verify it too to make sure it's there. So is there any, I guess, in the final inspection, and I guess even in the pre-engineering phase, when you're going through some of these component lists, is there anything that like you use to kind of help identify the different components or places that you're looking to make sure that certain boxes are checked, or is it really just paying attention to all the finite details? I guess, like what advice would you have for somebody that's trying to do this on their own?
Well, I think there's a lot there, and I think so. Let's talk about weight. We'll talk about the underside, and then we'll talk about that. So just keep me on track there, so I don't forget. Right. So you talked about different materials in the aerial, right? So if I want to go with an aluminum aerial, it's probably going to save me weight over a traditional steel aerial. Now, with the newer or higher tensile steel, I'm not 100% sure where that's going to put us weight wise. But again, when you go with aluminum, hey, we're going to go aluminum. We're going to have some increased corrosion protection properties with that. And we're going to decrease some weight. But what are we going to do when we go aluminum? We're going to increase the overall height, or the height and width really of the aerial itself, because that material has to get bigger to hold all that weight. So again, you go from, hey, I need to be under 12 foot to, with an aluminum ladder, it's very difficult to get under 12 foot. So, that factors into that, right? So we saved weight, but we added height. We added corrosion protection, but again, we added height, and we limited our capabilities to get into certain places, get under bridges, things like that. The other thing, material and weight wise, is you see a lot of people building these big, you're already into a 100-inch cab, and then you put a 10, a 16, a 20-inch raised roof on it. That extra material, no matter what it is going to add some weight to the front of your fire truck. So, you see that, and along with that weight, it also is going to decrease, especially on an aerial ladder, it's going to decrease some of your scrub area because of that cab, whether it's length or width or height, being in the way of that aerial, whether it's a mid mount or a rear mount, being able to swing around. So, again, there are certain things we can do. We can tilt the cab out of the way, or, turn the cab out of the way. But you get on a tight street somewhere, that's not always a possibility. And if you're pulling in behind an engine or a couple engines trying to get to a building, that increased height, length, width of the cab, not to mention the weight of it, not so much a scrub area, but just in the overall aspects of the fire truck, is going to have an effect on the capability of your apparatus. So, material wise, you need to think about that. Hey, I'm building a stainless steel cab, and I'm going to add all this stuff on top of it. That's probably going to affect a lot of my front end. Aluminum, not as much, but it's still there. It's still going to have some effect on it. And then operationally too, it's going to have an effect on it as well. And then same thing, choosing a type of material for your ladder, it's going to have an effect on your build end your operational capabilities at some point. So again, you have to think about that. We're talking at work, we went from a traditional steel ladder to a lower tensile or a higher tensile, smaller ladder, less weight. And we've had people complaining that the ladder bounces a little bit, that it's shaky. Obviously it is. It's not as bulky. But again, you need to think about that as you are building out these. We've saved weight. We've done certain things with the type of material we're choosing, but we're possibly making people who are uncomfortable on ladders be even more uncomfortable on ladders. So, again, there's a little bit to think about there. You got anything? If not, I'm going to move to the underside.
No, move right on the underside. That was good.
Okay. So again, underside, we talk about talking different types of materials. Again, this is somewhere where you need to be careful. If you say, I want an aluminum fire truck, there are some builders who are going to build you an all aluminum fire truck. If you say, I want stainless steel, they're going to build stainless steel. And with the exception of the frame rails, the supports for the body compartments, supports for the pump panel, all that stuff is going to be made out of the same type of material that the pie is made out of. However, there are some manufacturers whose frame supports or not frame supports, but the structural supports for the body are made out of steel. And they don't build it out of anything else. So again, this is where you want to look into how this fire truck is being constructed and making sure that you're providing the proper corrosion protection to all of the pieces of equipment that you need to have protected. And you need to ask the manufacturer or your builder, hey, what are the options for this corrosion? What is going to allow me to build the longest lasting fire truck? If they only build a steel substructure, it does a tank frame, are there upgrades we can do on a tank frame where all the water is going to be, where the potential for water to fall out of the overflow and run down the tank frame and sit on, the rails where the tank's sitting? Are there different different options for that? Can I do stainless there on top of the stainless? Is it all aluminum? Is stainless not available because of that? These are all questions that you want to ask. You talked about the fuel tanks. When you're reading your spec, if you're just looking at the component list on a fuel tank, it'll say fuel tank. You don't know what it is until you get into the actual long verbiage of the spec. Is it a hot rolled steel fuel tank? That obviously is going to rust the fastest out of anything. Is it, can we upgrade it to an aluminum fuel tank, which would be better? Can we upgrade it to a stainless steel fuel tank, which would be the best? Again, people have different histories with all that, but you want to weigh out all the options. What's available to me to make this truck last longer? Obviously, adding paint to any one of those three is going to increase that protection. But again, you want to have these conversations. Same thing, the standard air reservoir for your brake tanks, your air horns is going to be a painted steel. Are there options available for aluminum, stainless? Again, you want to have these conversations because, like you said earlier, that stuff is just eating the underside, the road salt, the rocks, all that stuff that they're putting on our roads is just blowing up underneath there. And then whatever's wet is going to sit there and continue to get wet. So again, you want to have these conversations. How, are there splash guards available between the wheel wells and the frame rails? That used to be a standard. You used to have a sheet of, material running across there. I mean, at least it was for me. I remember having to reach back in there and wash the wheel wells all the time and, scrubbing that area behind it. Somewhere along the way, they took that out. Now, is it an option to put some type of material back in there? Even something like a rubber flap to keep the water from coming off the wheel wells and running up into the tank frame is going to increase your capabilities of having that truck last longer. So again, you have to have those conversations with your salesman on what's available. I mean, $2,000, $3,000, $4,000 up front on $1 million fire truck, $1.5 million fire truck is, again, small potatoes when you're looking at it down the road, dropping, a couple grand to repair corrosion issues that you could have helped avoid at the beginning.
I think something else on the other side, two things. One, you talked about something, briefly there, and I think I want to go back and, I was teaching at FDIC. We talked about the specs a bit out there, and I kind of hit this point, and I think it's pretty important because someone that doesn't really work with apparatus specs much, the three kind of main parts of an apparatus specification. So you have obviously the drawing, right? The famous Tom Shan quote, I'm going to say it every time I ever talk about a fire truck drawing, is any fire truck can fit on an 8.5 by 11 sheet of paper, right? Doesn't mean it's going to fit in your first year of your firehouse. So you have this drawing with all these dimensions on it. That little guy that's all different heights depending on who the manufacturer is. There's no real standard for a lot of that stuff. It's kind of just what that manufacturer wants to offer. And that's one piece to the puzzle. It's nice because it lays everything out. So it's for the visual people. Then you have your component list is the next one. And it kind of lists what's going to kind of go in your fire truck spec. But I think the important part of that, and what I look at it as, is like an index, right? This is the order that manufacturer wants to talk about these components. Some start front to back to front, bottom up, top down. There's all these different ways that each manufacturer can talk about it. So when you're looking at specs, it's hard to say side to side, these are exact comparisons because they kind of have them in different spots depending on the manufacturer. And then the last one is the full written spec. And I feel like if I took a poll of the entire fire service in the United States, we would be at 20% of people that are actually going out there to final inspection, buying fire trucks that have actually read that entire written spec. And again, that is a couple hundred pages depending on your fire truck, right? It's a very, very deep, thick document with a lot of information in there, but that is how your fire truck's being built. So if you have anything else to add into that, I think that's a very important point to make when you're looking at some of these options we're talking about. You're going to see frame rails and you might see some dimensions of the frame rail. We're not going to go into a whole lot of detail of what that looks like. The conversation we're having now is past those first two sheets of paper. It's past the drawing that everyone posts on Facebook, past the component list that a fire department will share with another fire department of, look at our nice fire truck. This is how we made it. It's past all of that, and it goes into the actual bread and butter of how this fire truck's being made. And that spec is, if I ever want to look at someone's spec and understand their fire truck, that's what I want to look at, not just the picture or the drawing.
You're right. That written spec is, in the fire truck manufacturing for your apparatus should be the Bible. I mean, that's where everything should be, and it should be listed out. And if it's not, you need to call it out. You should know what brand light is going to be used as a compartment light, what brand light is going to be used as a perimeter light, how it's going to function, what switches are going to turn it on. That should all be listed out fully in that spec. And then again, like you said, that's where you're going to see the frame rails. How are the frame rails built? Do they have a channel, a secondary liner, a frame liner in them? If they have a frame liner, and this is another big thing, if you put a frame liner in it, how is the frame treated? Is it painted after the frame liners are put in? Are the frame liners painted separately and then put in? One of the best things I can recommend is that if you have a frame liner, make sure that frame liner is sealed so that liquid or water is not getting in between the two frames and allowed to sit in there and then continue the rot process from the outside. If it's painted before it gets in, obviously, before we put it together, that's another layer of protection. So when the two frame rails are sitting there rubbing, there's at least an extra layer of protection that has to get rubbed off before we start to see any damage. Obviously, hopefully it's bolted together tight enough that we don't see necessarily that friction rub, but you're going to see that at some point. Bolts are going to come loose or whatever. So you want to do everything you can. But again, if you just look at the stripper or the component list, it's just going to say frame rails with an L liner or a C liner or, a full width liner, or maybe the liner's only at the front axle. But that's all that's going to say. You need to really get into the spec and make sure that it's taken care of and built properly and built the way you want it to. And then if it's not, you need to call that out and have that added. And, the seal, depending on your manufacturer, if you want it sealed, that might be listed with the paint section. So it might not be listed until the very back page of your spec. So again, you need to kind of look and read through and find where all these little parts are going to fit together But that is a really big reading that spec is probably one of the most important things that you can do to make sure that you understand your fire truck, and then making sure that the information that you want is in that spec. If it's not, they kind of work hand in hand, right? You want it all in a written spec, but maybe it's in the component list or the stripper, and then you can, pull that out and say, all right, well, this is the brand light that we have. It's listed here. It's not written out in the written spec, but the perimeter light and the perimeter light, they match up. So you got to look at both of them. You got to go back and forth and flip back and forth. Like you said, an index is the best way to describe that thing, and that's really what that is. But you really, really want to be into that spec if you're on a committee building a fire truck.
I think one thing, we were together on this one for Arlington. We went out there and we bought 2 ladder trucks, side by side, identical in every way and fashion. And you go out to the inspection floor and you start to kind of figure out. And the first thing I noticed we're in the back looking towards the front, and the roof ladder was mounted behind the signboard on the officer side of one and the driver's side of the other. And so then we start going back through, right? You go through the stripper, the component list, and it just says that there's a 14-foot double-ended ladder up there mounted. All right, well, cool. Let's pull out the written spec. What does the written spec say? Pretty much the same thing, right? That was a gap, right? That was a gap between the manufacturer, the salesperson, and the fire department, us, right? Where we didn't specify that's, we want this on the officer side because our operating pedestal is on the driver's side. Like, get that out of the view of the driver operator so they have a better sight line down the aerial. And that's just a consideration. Another point was one of the rigs on the interior had black, painted interior, right, for protection, and for cleanability. And all the screw heads were painted black. The other one, none of the screw heads were painted black. And again, you flip through that book. And so for us, we're going and buying fire trucks here. These are all notes we're taking now. This is how specific we are in our spec. If you're buying a fire truck once every 20 or 30 years, you might not have to be that specific. But as we start going through and we have twins and fire trucks in this larger fleet that are the same, now we have to start. Now we have silver screws and black screws. Like, which ones do you buy to stock to start replacing parts in a fire truck, right? So it gets kind of past that initial part and more of that maintenance. And I think that's how detailed you really need to be. And it is so much work to build a fire truck and do it right that I think some people take it for granted or don't necessarily understand the work until they're really in it, or something really gets messed up, right? Something's wrong.
Yeah, and there's another document that you have to think of too that it should be reflected in the component list, but it may not be updated in the written spec. Is that when you go for your pre-construction meeting, any changes you make are going to be on a change order. So you have to be able to compare all 3 documents at that point, because the changes you make, at pre-con probably will not show up. They're not probably going to give you another written spec. They may, but your component list should change. So again, you have to kind of follow through with that, and the change orders are going to supersede everything else at that point. So again, you need to, with just one more document that you got to be familiar with and look up.
One other thing that I kind of thought about when we're looking at the underside, and you talked about the different materials in there, and we see this inside compartments a lot, but it can also be on the underside. And we've seen it a handful of times on the underside of rigs, are the dissimilar metals, right? We've gone to plenty of places where they have one type of metal and they put some sort of slide out tray, and they don't isolate those metals with the different metals, and now you have that rust and corrosion and the oxidation that's happening between the metals. So getting some sort of isolator, we've seen it with the tank mounts going into mounts a water tank in older vehicles. You see it all over the place. So again, making sure, I'm not huge into all the metals and how everything kind of works. Chemistry wasn't the strongest suit I had, but that's something you need to understand, right? What are these metals going to do? What am I putting underneath? What are the compartments made out of? What are the compartments sitting on? How are the compartments mounted? And then what's going inside of the compartment and how is that getting mounted? Because you could have 4 or 5 different metal types there that all don't like each other. And within 5 and 10 years, you're going to really see a huge problem in your compartments. So that was a kind of another point to bring up.
Yeah, I think, again, aluminum body with stainless steel lighting flanges, things like that going in, you're going to want to make sure that there's some type of rubber. And again, that should all be called out for in the spec. So you want to check the spec and make sure that barrier is there. Same thing. If I have a steel frame rail and I'm putting aluminum um, substructure on it, or a stainless substructure, and an aluminum tank frame or whatever, I want to make sure that there's rubber isolations there. And that's, again, it's all in that specs. You want to read it. Another, like you talked about, what are my slides made out of? Are they cheaper slides that are made out of steel that are going to maybe not only cause that difference of material corrosion, but also are they going to rust faster? Because if the compartment gets wet and water sits in there, is that steel going to, is it going to rust away at that steel? Is there an aluminum option or a stainless option for the slides? Things like that. What other type of corrosion protection are available for your screws, or for any, different type of material or puncture that you're going to put in there? Again, you want to see that. You want to read, hey, when my frame rails are being built, is every hole that's put in a frame rail going to be put in it prior to the treatment? Whether it's a galvanized treatment or if it's a paint, are all those holes going to be treated prior to that, or any holes going to have to be drilled afterwards? If so, how is the treatment of that hole going to be done? Most of your holes in your frame rails should be drilled prior to the frames being put together. So again, you don't have that issue. And there should be no extra holes in your frame rail when you're going through that inspection process. If there is, you want to question it and you want to figure out, how it was, corrected, and the type of process that was done to minimize that corrosion. Same thing, we talked about the rubber straps between stainless steel hangers for the fuel tank and the air reservoirs. What type of barrier is between there? Are there rubber? Are there, some type of, make sure that as you're going through that inspection that you're checking them and making sure that those two different types of materials aren't touching. Because again, we're going to have those issues there. So it's all over. It's not only on the underside of the cab, it's on the front face of the cab where the windows touch, or where the window cutouts are, where the light bezels go in. Any penetration in your fire truck is an avenue for, corrosion to begin. And that's where that process is going to start, early on. So we want to make sure that's taken care of properly in that corrosion process, no matter what type of material you use.
Yeah, I think that was a big one for me. That, again, like I said, I didn't really know a whole lot about it, and starting to do the inspections. You're looking at it and you're like, oh my God, this is crazy. And you start pointing it out, and it's, you have all these tools on a slide out, and you start digging in or pulling the tools out, and which doesn't happen often. You're emptying a compartment out, especially not an emergency scene, and you start seeing behind there, deep in the compartment, you're seeing some of the corrosion show, and you're like, wow, this is crazy. And again, all it takes is a piece of rubber, 30-cent piece of rubber stops that entire thing, and just cleaning it up and making sure it's good to go. And again, that could be as big as being under where the tank is sitting, which is obviously a lot larger of a problem if that's not taken care of. And we've seen it all. We've seen it all. One thing to kind of, I guess, talk about quick before we get to the final point there of the recommendations. When we talked about weight, and you were talking a lot about that front, the cab portion of the fire truck. And I think that's where we run into a lot of weight issues. The back, you can throw in, two pretty huge tandem axles and carry a pretty good amount of weight. In the front, you're pretty limited on what weight you can carry up there. And when you start talking about materials and stuff, I think it's important to talk about, the weight of the fire truck altogether. And, when we're weighing fire trucks, NFPA has recommendations and standards on weight. And so from side to side, it's no more than 7% deviation from side to side, right? And front to back, there's no NFPA standard. It just points back to the OEM of the cabin chassis. So if you're going to use a, name brand, Freightliner International, Navistar, whatever type of body, Ford, Dodge, they have their front to back ratios that you would want to go and seek out to make sure you're not exceeding that front to back ratio. But if you're using some sort of other manufacturer, right, that's manufacturing from the beginning to end, that's something you might want to ask about as you start going through the process. Within the last month, we found a fire truck that had a 50-50 split from front to back. That's way too close. That weight distribution is not where it should be. You should not have as much weight on the front as you do in the back. And again, that's something that weight analysis we talked about way in the beginning that you need to look at. And if it's, going from a stainless to an aluminum cab to lighten up that load, or even dropping seats out of there, that's something that you really need to pay attention to. And getting a lot of that raised roof, bigger cab, whatever you can do to offload that weight off the front, that's going to really help you a lot in life. And so I think it doesn't just have the corrosion resistance or money tied to its weight and really how your fire truck's going to function. And then going back to drivability, right? You're adding more weight to the fire truck. That's less ability to stop, less ability to steer, right? You're adding a whole lot of other stuff onto the vehicle that maybe doesn't necessarily need to be there. So I mean, there's a whole lot to think about for that. And then, to kind of sum it up, I guess, the last thing I kind of mentioned before, and we'll kind of hit it here, final midpoint, even before, the pre-engineering, I guess, the pre-engineering conference. Because again, if you're pre-engineering, you've already signed the contract. And so now you're past the negotiated price point. And this could be 2 years into when a fire truck was actually signed for. But, from day one until, the fire truck comes in, is there any, for different, I guess, builds and manufacturers and different materials, you cover a lot of information. I learned a lot of information. What's kind of some big take-home tips that you can kind of offer to somebody when working with their spec and maybe looking for different metals and stuff like that?
I think, the big take-home spec or the big take-home is that you need to get a weight analysis early on in your build process. Your initial specification should come with a weight analysis based on what's being proposed, because you want to see are the axles the right size. We just did one a pre-con where we were able to drop the axle from a 20,000 or a 22 to an 18 because of the weight rating. Well, the problem is that in the time period from when the contract was signed to the time period when we were doing a pre-con, is that the axle cost of a lower rated axle was actually higher than what they paid for the initial higher rated axle. The problem is if you keep it, your ride quality is going to be severely hampered. And then if your ride quality is hampered and it's not, the apparatus isn't riding right, then we're going to have issues with the frame rails being damaged, the body being damaged because of the way it's bouncing around. So you have to take care of that up front. So if you don't have a dealer or a manufacturer who's going to say, hey, listen, that was our fault, we should have caught that in a weight analysis, then you're going to be stuck paying more money for a lower rated axle if you want to do the right thing and treat your truck right. So get that analysis, weight analysis done early on. Get everything you can done to your fire truck before you sign a contract. So have these conversations about what corrosion protections are available, what material the apparatus is being made out of, and where it's at in the fire truck. Is everything the same? Are they different? What do the differences mean? And how is that going to affect all of, everything that we're going to put into this? Just because you treat one portion of the fire truck doesn't necessarily mean that the manufacturer is going to treat the next portion of it if you don't call it out. So again, if you coat or paint one axle, if they don't say, hey, we're going to do the same treatment to the rear axle, then again, you might miss that out. And you go there and you have a frame, a job color red front axle and a black rear axle, because that just is the way it was called out. So you want to make sure, and again, all that's in that big spec the big written spec that we called out. You got to be reading that. Start with that weight analysis early on. That's the big thing for any of it, and go from there.
Yeah, no, I think we cover a lot of material here. It's pretty dense. I think, a couple points that I kind of picked up on and kind of just from doing the fleet evaluations kind of sees like, you go and find your neighbor's fire truck and you're looking at them. And we've talked about that, for rescue engines or ladder trucks, like visit your neighbors and check them out. same thing, right? Visit your neighbors and pull back the curtain, right? Go underneath the fire truck and see what it looks like. What did they do? What options did they choose? And what does it look like, right? The roads aren't that dissimilar from, 10 minutes down the road or less, depending on how far your neighboring company is away. And if they have an XYZ manufacturer that you're looking at and it's 10, 15 years old and you're looking to keep it 20 years, that's a great time to look at that fire truck, look underneath, see what they've done to take care of it or not, and see what the underside looks like. Manufacturers don't really change too much along the way. And so, you can kind of see over that time frame what would generally happen to your fire truck. I think that's a big one. Asking for help. I'll always say that. Obviously, there's a lot of information, a lot of stuff out there. Ask for help, right? This is a lot to undertake. And if you don't paint the frame rails, there's really no going back and doing it again. It's not going to cost you $4,000 10 years down the road when your fire truck's rotting out and you have a lot of corrosion and rust issues. And again, just that, can't stress that inspection enough of, every once in a while, at least once a year, going, as you weigh the fire truck, like you should be doing per NFPA 1910 now, you should be going underneath and doing that inspection, just taking a look to see what's down there. We found some where tanks were leaking for a while, and they go to fix the tank leak and they fix it, but then they don't address how long that water had been leaking down on the rest of the fire truck, and the underside's pretty shot. So that's something that you can kind of catch as you go along.
Yeah.
Any other final thoughts you have on this topic?
Yeah, real fast. The one thing we didn't talk about is pumps. Again, that's something you want to make sure if your manufacturer doesn't paint it as a standard, you want to call it out. And the same thing, job color, paint your pump job color. Make sure all your connections, your Victaulic connections, your plumbing, everything, get everything that you can paint it. It really will add on to the cost of your fire truck. And again, that goes with how long are you going to keep this thing? How much money is it worth up front, for you to provide this protection? If you're going to get rid of it 7 or 8 years, maybe it's not worth it to you. If the potential for you to keep it 15, 20 years is, then we want to build that protection up front. And then not only build it up front, we want to make sure that yearly we're cleaning the bottom of the fire truck, especially in the wintertime. Now, maybe even more often in the wintertime. We have a sprayer that it runs over as it backs in the bay or whatever. And then we're treating that with some type of corrosion protection, a yearly corrosion protection that, and that Carwell, the crown is a linseed type material. It's an oil, a thin oil. It's not going to make a big mess, and it's just going to add that extra protection. So make sure that you're evaluating the fire truck both at the beginning of the build process and throughout the life of it. Buy what you need, and then continue to take care of what you bought for the rest of it. The apparatus' service life.
Awesome. Yeah, like I said, I think that's a lot of information that we kind of covered there. If there's any more questions, obviously reach out to us. You can find us emergencyvehicleresponse.com. There's a contact form there, or us to our email addresses. If you have any other ideas for topics, or you want to see a topic that maybe we've covered before, go into more depth, please reach out. I mean, we're kind of taking a lot of these topics on as we see them, and people are reaching out with topics, which is helpful for us too, to help kind of answer the questions of that are out there in the fire service. So if you have any topics that you have in mind, reach out to chris.mcloon@claringevents.com. And again, any feedback, we appreciate feedback as well. But appreciate you guys taking the time for listening in, and we'll see you on the next episode.
This podcast is brought to you by the National Fallen Firefighters Foundation. Their mission is to honor America's fallen fire heroes, support their families, colleagues, and organizations, and work to reduce preventable firefighter death and injury. Learn more at firehero.org.